All right, I'd now like to welcome on a very special guest. I thought this was probably the case and did some research. The most frequent guest in the history of the show. It is Nick Zararis. Nick, what's up?
Nothing much, chilling. Wear a lot of hats. I mean, football, hockey. I wear a lot of hats, so I'm glad I hold that distinction.
Yes, and by far the most dependable person in terms of, hey, I need to record a podcast like tomorrow. Can you find some time? And you're like, yeah, sure. Like you were just saying before we got on, it's just nonstop. But that's much worse things you could be doing with your time all day. So happy to have you here. This has become an annual tradition. I think this is the third
Yeah.
year that we've done this episode now, which is for small brained people like me that can only focus on one sport at a time, or at least during football season, not be able to focus on anything except football. And basically have missed everything that's been going on in the world, whether it's the NBA or in this case, the NHL. You're obviously huge hockey guy, huge Rangers fan, NHL fan. So you are able to keep up with all of this during football season. So this episode is for everybody like me. It's less of when we do a football podcast, it's much more of a conversation where we're both giving our opinions and talking things through. This is more of like an interview. This is more me being like, so tell me about uh, the Vancouver Canucks, and then you are just going to give me answers on things that I need to know and people listening need to know. So that's the general gist of this episode. So whether you are like me and kind of don't pay attention to the NHL regular season up to this point, and now you want to get in before the playoffs come around. It should be really informative, give you good information on who to look for in the playoffs, anybody you maybe place a future bet on or something like that. And if you are just a regular hockey fan, it's still good information. So um, we're just gonna kind of run through. It's unfair to some teams. Like there are going to be some people who are going to be the why didn't you talk about my team crowd, which I think for a regular preseason preview is fair, but at this point in the season, unfortunately, we kind of already know teams that suck and are not worth talking about. When you're this late into the season, it's inevitably going to be kind of top heavy because we basically know which teams are good. But you never know. I kind of left the door open for Nick and basically said anything that seems interesting that if you didn't watch hockey all year, you can just bring up and talk about. So we'll do that. But how we're going to start it off is uh, basically I went to one sports book and it ended up being very convenient that there were 8 teams with 12 to 1 or better odds to win the Stanley Cup, and 4 of them were from the East and 4 of them were from the West. So that was a pretty easy way for me. And again, all I did to prepare for this is look at the odds to win the Stanley Cup and look at the standings. And that's basically all I have going for me in terms of which teams are legit this year. So that's really all I'm going off of. So as we go through that, you might say, yeah, this team is way overrated. They shouldn't be in that top 4. Or, yeah, like this is probably the best team. And as you look, there are some teams that their odds don't exactly correlate with where they are in the standings. So we can kind of go through that as well. So we're going to start with the Eastern Conference. And those 4 teams out of the East with 12 to 1 odds or better are the Panthers, Rangers, Bruins, and Hurricanes. In that order, the Panthers are 8 to 1, the Bruins are 10 to 1, the Rangers and Hurricanes are both 11 to 1. So let's start with those 4 teams and just kind of high level, which ones are contenders, which ones are not. Obviously, all 4 of them are good teams, but what do you think about those top 4 in the East?
I think Florida is the best team in the league, the entire league, not just the East at this exact moment as we're recording this. They have proof of concept because they went to the cup final last year with largely the same team. They turned over a couple of the weaker links on the bottom half of the lineup. They brought in some experimental pieces, guys who had kind of struggled in other places, like Oliver Ekman Larson and Nico Mikkola, to kind of fill out the bottom half of their defense. And they've got the star power you need to go on a deep run. Matthew Tkachuk and Sasha Barkov, two of the 20 best forwards in the entire league. Sam Reinhart is, I want to say he's over 35 goals already, and we're only in February. He's got like 24 power play goals. He's really good. They're getting healthy. They've got the requisite experience. That's kind of a thing in hockey. It's really hard to win a Stanley Cup without making the playoffs a couple of times in your championship window, because there's just a certain level of requisite experience almost to kind of get over that hump. That's one of the issues that I would say I have with some of the teams that might be in a tier below this, teams like the Devils, the Islanders, the Leafs, who maybe aren't in great spots right now, but you might be considering for a future, where those groups just don't have enough experience. And then going down, I think I would put the Rangers ahead of the Bruins ever so slightly, just because the Bruins just aren't as talented of a team. Their path might be a little bit easier in the playoffs, because the way that hockey does the playoffs is kind of stupid, frankly, where it's based on divisions, not conferences, where the first place team in each division plays a wild card team, and then the second and third place team in each division plays each other. So that's probably why the Bruins have a slightly better price, because they're going to get an easier matchup, because the third place team in that division isn't as competitive as the third place team in the Metro. But largely speaking, that makes sense. I mean, Carolina's underperformed for a lot of this season, and that's partly because of the goaltending. Their presumptive starter came into the year, had blood clots in November, hasn't ramped back up yet. He came back a few weeks ago, but hasn't really gotten back into the mix yet. And goaltending is one of those checklist things you need to have. You don't need to have an amazing goalie, but you need to have a decent goalie to get in the door. And that's kind of why I think Carolina is the bottom of the four, even though they're a pretty talented team.
Yeah, so that's always like, again, my hockey brain is like mostly like a postseason hockey brain. Like I don't have and would never pretend to be like a knowledgeable on like, oh, this is what this team needs to like get through a season. But if you watch enough just playoff hockey, you hear the same things repeated again and again and again, year after year after year. And a lot of one of the like top two or three things is always the one goaltender that gets hot in the playoffs, and maybe in the regular season wasn't even the best goaltender or the most consistent goaltender.
That was Vegas
but
last year. That was exactly what happened. Aiden Hill, I think, had like 100 career NHL starts last year. Never had been particularly good, but he was great in the playoffs, and Vegas won the Stanley Cup. You just need to be decent. That's really all you need to get in the door as a goalie. Just be decent, and if you get hot at the right time, magical shit happens.
Yeah. So of the top, or not even of that top four, but just in the entire Eastern Conference, is there one goalie that you look at as like above the rest in terms of like if he plays his best, that team's really, really hard to beat?
It's interesting you bring this up, because that was the topic of interest. You said if something weird was happening or something interesting. A lot of the goalies who have extensive track records of being really good are all kind of stinking at the same time. Like Shesterkin on the Rangers is having the worst season of his career so far. Andrei Vasilevsky, who's going to be a Hall of Famer someday, is having the worst season of his career since he became a starter for Tampa. Ilya Sorokin for the Islanders having his worst year as a starter. UC Saros of the Predators has been a really good goalie for a long time, but he's having a pretty mediocre season. Jake Ottinger of the Stars. So scoring is really up this year on all fronts. For I think it's the fourth straight season, power play opportunities per game are up, which is heavily influencing scoring being up. So as far as the East right now, the goalie playing the best is the Bruins goalie, Jeremy Swayman, but Bobrovsky on the Panthers is having a pretty solid season. Not as good as he was in the playoffs last year, but definitely above average. So the Bruins aren't the most talented forward-wise or outward skaters, but they've had the best goalie play of any team in the East so far, for sure.
Yeah. But yeah, that's interesting that so many guys are kind of having a down year at the same time, because then it does kind of open up to like, we do know how good they could be theoretically. Yeah. So if one of them finds their form at the right time, then all of a sudden then that team moves to kind of the top of the list if they catch fire in the playoffs. So that's obviously something to look for as we get into the first round of the playoffs, and even towards the end of the regular season, if one or two guys end up catching really solid form at the right time, is always something to look for. But that does open the door when those teams at the top are kind of, whether it's the goalie or anywhere really. And it's kind of what makes the NHL playoffs the best of any league. I think a lot of people make that argument that it's the best of any major American sports league playoffs is the NHL because it's the most wide open. I mean, in the NFL for so long, we saw the Patriots every year. It's like, well, it's probably going to be the Patriots. And now it's the Chiefs. It's probably going to be the Chiefs. And in the NBA, it's the same. Even if it's not the same teams, it's the same players. Wherever those players end up, it's probably going to be one of those. Whereas in the NHL, it does seem kind of wide open. You have teams that just kind of sneak into the playoffs and then can win the whole thing if they get hot at the right time. So outside of in the Eastern Conference, outside of that top four of the Panthers, Rangers, Bruins, Hurricanes, is there any team you could see if they just get hot at the right time going on a crazy underdog run?
If the Devils trade for a goalie, the Devils are talented enough, but their goaltending has been an abomination this season. It's like, I want to say their team save percentage is like 885, 890, and league average is 900. Their goaltending has just been awful. Their best defenseman being hurt all season is definitely hurting them as well. But if they had league average goaltending, they would be in a significantly better position. The deadline is March 8th, whatever that Friday is, the first full week of March. If they had a goalie, the Devils could be that team. The Leafs, I would like to say, could be that team, but until I see them win multiple series in the same season, I'm just not going to eat the cheese. I think they're good, but until they do it, I would rather be wrong about this being the year they finally break through, knowing, I have the last 10 years of evidence that they can't break through.
Yeah, definitely. Again, from just my playoff hockey brain, not the team you want to invest in terms of, this is the year. Like, if it ends up being the year one year, then good for the people of Toronto. You deserve it. But we are not going to invest our money or our takes or anything into that team until we see that something could change. So yeah, it's again, there's a couple of the same things if you only watch playoff hockey that you hear every year. It's how talented the Leafs are and how they have the Austin Matthews and all these guys that are like the most talented players in the league, and then go out in the first or second round. So that's it for the Eastern Conference for now. We can kind of circle back after we go through the West and then talk more big picture. But looking at these teams, in the Western Conference, that top four is the Canucks, Avalanche, Stars, and Oilers. The Oilers are tied with the Panthers for the favorite to win the Cup at plus 800. The Avalanche right behind at 850. The Stars are at 10-1, and the Canucks are at 12-1. So out of that top four, and it's interesting. I was looking. Obviously, this doesn't mean everything in any sport, but the Canucks have the most points in the West, actually have the most points in the entire NHL, but are towards the bottom of those top teams in terms of the odds. So let's start with them. Why has their regular season been so good, but people are not respecting them quite as much as those other teams?
Because this is the first year the Canucks have been good in 7-8 years. They have consistently underperformed their talent for a long time, and everything's kind of lined up well for them this year. Brock Besser had a brutal year last year, a hand thing, family stuff, had multiple family members pass away. Elias Pettersson only played like 40, 50 games last year. Quinn Hughes had a terrible defensive partner. JT Miller, a decent year, but bad defense overall. They changed their coach in December of last year. And if they had changed their coach earlier in the season, there's an argument that if they played at the pace they'd played at once Rick Tocchet became the coach, they could have snuck in as the last team in last year. But they've really been the story of the season because this kind of came out of nowhere. They didn't do a whole lot to change the roster. It's just guys who have been there playing a lot better. And it starts with the goalie. Thatcher Demko was horrendous last year, but Demko is going to have a real chance to win the Vezina as best goalie in the league. That's how good he's been this season. So that's the biggest thing, is a lot of people just skeptical that a team that hasn't made the playoffs in quite a while is going to go on the run the first time they get back in. Not to say they can't. They've got as much star power as any team in the league. But the one thing that's working against them is that the West is just a lot better than the East. When conceptually, The only team from the East I would put in the tier with Dallas, Colorado. I don't put Edmonton in that top tier, but they're an attractive team and they'll get a better line than they'll get a worse line than they probably should because of the name recognition. I would put Vegas in that tier. I don't know where Vegas is at in the pricing. I know they put another star player on LTIR today, so maybe that influences where they are, but they're going to add pieces at the deadline, and both of the stars that they have on injured reserve are going to come back for the playoffs. But in that top tier, I would say Dallas, Colorado, Vegas when healthy, and Florida. Vancouver, I would like to see it. Vancouver, I need to see them how they play in the playoffs and how their game translates to the playoffs before I'm ready to put them in that top tier.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Oilers for a second, because like you said, they do. Obviously, Connor McDavid has had hype like we've never really seen in the NHL in our lifetime. I feel like he's just like a next level type of guy, but we have not seen the really playoff performance yet. And obviously it's team game. You can't carry, especially in hockey, you can't carry a team to winning playoff series, but eventually people are going to start saying, like, if you're that good, like, we got to start seeing something in terms of winning playoff series, eventually winning a cup. And they are now, like I said, tied for the favorites. And you said that that's probably a little bit of Connor McDavid pricing, where they know people are going to want to bet on them to win the cup, so they can shorten that line a little bit. But what has kind of held them back from, in his career so far, from being a team that can win in the playoffs? And is there anything different this year that could move them past that hurdle?
The single biggest thing has been goaltending. The Oilers have been trying to get goalie right since he got there. The first year, his rookie season, they traded for Cam Talbot, who was the Rangers' backup at the time, and he was pretty good that first year. They went to, I want to say, the second round of the playoffs, and they lost to the Ducks. They've made the playoffs a handful of times with different goalies, whether it be Mike Smith, Jack Campbell. This past year it was Stuart Skinner, and the Oilers came out of the gate this year horrendous. They were in dead last in the entire league around American Thanksgiving, and then they rattled off 16 wins in a row from December to January, and now they're back in the thick of things. But the goaltending is still a really big question mark. Stuart Skinner is their starter. He was really good in the regular season last year, but he was atrocious against the Kings in the first round, to the point where they benched him at the end of a couple of games because they were getting blown out so bad. They brought in the backup, and there was genuine conjecture about starting the backup over him. They ultimately won that first round series against the Kings, but then lost later down the road. Again, the Oilers are kind of like the Leafs, where until I see it, I'm not going to believe it, because the Oilers put way too much on McDavid, on Draisaitl, to make up for the deficiencies on the rest of the team. And you expect your star players to be able to do that. You know, that's part of being a good player, is you make up the gaps, but there's only so much you can do. You said it before. It's a team game, and great players can do a lot. But, you know, McDavid, Draisaitl, they're only going to play 23, 24 minutes a game. There's still another 37, 38 where they're not going to be on the ice. And the Oilers still have yet to get that recipe for those other 37 minutes right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not the NBA where it gets to the playoffs and it's like your stars are on the floor for all 48 minutes and 90% of the shot attempts go to one or two guys. You got to be much more well-rounded, and obviously scoring, defense, goaltending, all of that. So that's interesting to see if this year they can kind of get through to that next level. But we're talking about teams outside of that top four, which you already mentioned, the Vegas Golden Knights, who are obviously defending champions. Do you know when's the last time we had back-to-back Stanley Cup champions?
Tampa did it 2020 and 2021.
Oh, yeah, they just did it. Yeah. So obviously there's some recent history that said you can do it. And so I think that price is actually kind of interesting. You said you were saying you were wondering where they're priced at. They're at 14-1, which is behind 4 or 5 teams in the Western Conference. And where they're sitting now is second in the Pacific, and you said you can see them making some moves at the deadline. So what kind of moves do you think they should make and or will make, and why do you think that they are still kind of priced behind some of those other teams?
I think they're priced behind because people don't know when Jack Eichel and Mark Stone are going to come back from injury. Eichel got put on long-term injured reserve last Thursday, Wednesday, something like that, and Mark Stone got put on LTIR today, this morning, before we recorded. So people would like to know when those guys are going to come back. It is hard to go back to back. It happens more frequently in hockey than any other sport. I know we talk about hockey having a lot of parity, but that's mostly in the regular season. Because I mean, Tampa 2020, 2021, Pittsburgh 2016, 2017, and then the Blackhawks and Kings went back and forth for 4 straight years, where it was Blackhawks, Kings over a 4-year period. So it's doable. It is hard though, you know, that to get to the Cup final, they played, I want to say I think Vegas won the Cup in 22 playoff games total. It took them that long to get there. It's a lot of miles. Those are hard games to win. The game's a lot tighter. The minutes are a lot more grueling. Your star players have to play more in the playoffs. That's really the prohibitive, you know, why are they priced where they are? And ad wise, because the way hockey salary cap works, there are shenanigans where if you know these guys are going to be out close to the amount of time till you have left to the playoffs in hockey start second week of April. So we got a little bit of time, but there's a real assumption that they are going to go out and add a top 6 winger to replace Mark Stone in the interim. And then once the playoffs start, there's no salary cap. So they will be able to bring whoever they trade for at the deadline into the team. Then once the playoffs start, they'll bring Stone, they'll bring Eichel back, and they'll be over the salary cap. But because there's no salary cap in the playoffs, they will effectively be able to cheat the salary cap. So that's why I think Vegas, if you were going to make an argument for the next tier down, the issue against the argument against them, and you can make this argument for everybody, it's that the West is significantly better than the East. It is a lot more difficult. The comparison I would give you is it's very much like the AFC and the NFC, where the AFC has all of the really good teams, and then the NFC just had San Francisco. That's kind of what it is right now with hockey, where the West is the AFC with all of the star-laden teams like Colorado, Dallas, Vegas, Edmonton, Vancouver, and then the East is Florida, maybe the Rangers, and I'm not even that sold on the Rangers right now. So that's part of why I think the prices are where they are too in the West, is that these teams all got to play each other. And by the time you get to that conference final, you are going to be worn out.
Yeah, it's basically, the Panthers having the best odds to win the Cup is basically why the 49ers had the best odds to win the Cup, just because you're most likely to get to that game, or in this case, that series, which obviously makes your odds way better that you'll win it once you're there. But yeah, that's very interesting. So I feel like we kind of got from outside of that top 4 on both sides, and this is maybe an interesting time to also make these moves, kind of betting on what will happen at the trade deadline. Is you do have the Golden Knights at 14-1, and then potentially big long shot, you said the Devils at 25-1 if they can make a move at goalie, that could kind of push them into, again, in a weaker conference, if you want to take a shot on a team that could have an easier run to pull some upsets. That's interesting to look at. But I want to run through 3 different kind of scenarios, big picture, and this is also helpful for you because we can 3 different Stanley Cup Finals predictions, and then if you get one of the 3 right, I can just cut it and put the clip out and make it look like it was your one prediction and you got it right. So this is actually helpful for you. The 3 kind of scenarios I want to have you give answers for is, 1, just if it goes total chalk, the best team from the West, who you think is the best team from the West, best team from the East, and then who would win the Stanley Cup Finals. And then the second scenario would be just your kind of gut pick, like this is who I think it will be, West, East, and champion. And then third would be like a chaos scenario where everything kind of goes off the wall, and maybe not necessarily outside of those top 4, like you can pick one from the top 4, but just if things kind of go nuts, like you could see this team getting hot at the right time. So let's start with scenario number 1. If it goes straight chalk, who do you think is the best team from the West and East, and then who wins that series?
Dallas and Florida would be my chalk. I think Dallas has the deepest forward group of any team in the entire league. Thomas Harley, a defenseman, has really broken out for them this year and taken a lot of minutes. They're a team that'll trade for someone at the deadline, make their roster a little bit better. And their goalie has shown the ability to be really good in the playoffs when they've gotten there. 2 years ago, he had one of the best playoff series I've ever seen from a goalie in a losing effort in the first round series against the Flames. And then everything I said about Florida, they have the easiest path, and they're probably the best team, arguably, in the entire league. That would be the chalkiest. And I think Dallas has been on the periphery for a while now. They've made a couple conference finals. They went to the Cup final in 2020. They've taken their lumps. They kind of have the right recipe. They've got a veteran coach who's been to a couple Cup finals as well. I think they are the team that's most poised to kind of break through the glass ceiling that we see in hockey, where these teams that make the playoffs over and over and over again and then finally break through. That's a pretty recurring theme. Washington did that with Ovechkin in 2018. The Blues did that in 2019. The Avalanche did that 2 years ago. Vegas did that last year, where they just make the playoffs every single year pretty much. And the more chances you get at it, eventually you get the formula and the recipe right.
All right. I like that. And then I guess, so your gut pick, and maybe your gut is the best teams could just make it. But I guess outside of those
the
top
East,
two teams,
I don't think is this easy. It's never this easy, which is why I don't feel good about picking Florida or recommending Florida. When it looks this easy, that's where you get screwed over. Last year, the Bruins were the best regular season team in the history of the NHL, and they lost in the first round in a series. They lost 3 games in overtime. They lost 3 coin flips. All they had to do was win one of those coin flips, and Florida doesn't go to the Cup final. And my perception of Florida this year is very different, because if they go out in the first round last year, I don't really have proof of concept that their recipe works. So I really don't think it'll be Florida, but none of the other teams are all of that convincing. Like, I don't trust the Rangers to win 3 series just to get to the final. The Leafs, I don't. The Bruins, I don't. I picked Carolina a lot over the years to kind of break through, to be that team, that just the last team standing. They might be the best equipped to go on a long run just because the amount of forward and defensive depth they have. But gut-wise, I don't have a strong lean in the East. In the West, I think it'll end up being Dallas or Colorado. So my gut, if I had to pick from the West, I would say Colorado. From the East, if I had to pick, I'd probably still say Florida, but I don't feel good about that at all.
Yeah. All right. So final scenario, the chaos scenario. If it's not those top couple, 2 or 3 teams, who could be the 2 teams, one from each side, that could go on just get crazy hot and go on a run?
Just pure chaos. Devils Vegas. That's not out of the realm of possibility. Devils need to trade for a goalie, but they've got the talent to be good. I mean, they beat the Rangers last year. They kind of got exposed against Carolina, but I'm inclined to believe with more playoff experience, the Devils can get hot. Maybe the Leafs, but I'm not advising anybody to bet money on the Leafs. That just make the donation, give that to a charity. That's a more beneficial outcome to humanity. Yeah. The East is so much harder than the West to predict, in my opinion, because everybody's so bunched up in comparison to Florida.
All right. Well, that has given me a lot to think about, because this is also how I bet a future in the NHL and the NBA around this time, and then just kind of have a team or two to ride with the rest of the year. I think I might go with Vegas.
Vegas is fun. Vegas has the star power. They've got the really good players. They did it last year. The knock against any of them is the path is going to be difficult. That's the thing. If you're Vegas, you will be sweating for 4 straight rounds if you ride that future, because it's doable. It is entirely doable, because they more likely than not, they're going to fall from 2 to 3 just because they're missing 2 of their 4 best players, but they will make the playoffs. It's all about the matchups. If they fall, more likely than not, Edmonton's going to pass them. In a straight series, Vegas versus Edmonton, Edmonton will be the betting favorite, but I would take Vegas because
Yeah, I like
until I see
Vegas
some,
in that series.
yeah, I would like them in that series. And then in the second round, they would play either they would play Vancouver if they win, or the wild card team, whichever wild card team that may be. So the path for Vegas is feasible. It's just going to be a real sweat. The East,
Yeah.
the East, I got no feel on. The West, I think it's definitely one of Dallas, Colorado, or Vegas.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like that from Vegas though, being maybe kind of slow coming into the playoffs and then getting a couple big hitters back for the postseason. And then, like you said, they would probably be betting underdogs against Edmonton. And if they win that series, they'd probably be betting underdogs against Vancouver. But those are two teams that have not been able to prove it in the postseason as of now. Whereas you're taking the team that obviously did prove it, won it all. So it's not a bad position to be if you're talking about teams that you can trust. I kind of like that. So before we close, is there anything else that you have that's just anything from this NHL season that you think is worth talking about, or any storyline heading into the playoffs?
If you're looking for something interesting and fun for as far as something to bet, there's probably a good chunk of value on the MVP, the Hart Trophy, because McDavid missed a few weeks at the beginning of the season. He had a lower body injury, but he's back up to his normal self. He's, I want to say, like +4, +500, which just on pure value for the best hockey player in the world to win MVP. And he's going to push 120, 130 standings points. It's pretty close to fair value. That's the best value you are ever going to get to bet Connor McDavid to win MVP in February. And Nathan MacKinnon is having a really good season. He's already won a Stanley Cup. If you are invested in something that'll be fun because you get to bet on McDavid and you're getting a good price, that's something I would be very interested in doing. The only other thing is I have a Stars future from a few weeks ago. I got them at, I think, 12-1. So their price is a little bit better now. But as we get closer and we start to get a better understanding of what the deadline clarity will bring, because that'll be the real inflection point. Because if the Rangers go out and add a top 6 wing, I might be a little more bullish on them. If Carolina goes out and adds a goalie, the Devils go out and add a goalie, the Leafs go out and add a goalie, I'd be a bit more bullish on them. I don't see it for the Bruins. They've been close a couple of times, but it feels like they've kind of missed their window. Even if they add at the deadline, they would have a really hard recipe to win because they rely on defense and goaltending a lot to win. So the awards races are fun. The Norris Trophy is pretty wide open right now as well. Cale Makar is probably the slight betting favorite, but Adam Fox, Quinn Hughes, all in the mix. Charlie McAvoy in the mix. So I would say go look into the awards futures. Look for somebody who's probably second or third in the betting odds and have fun. When you get to bet on the Stars and you've got good value, that's the ideal future scenario for me. Is I'm getting to watch a good player or good team and they got a decent chance of making me some money. That's a good outcome.
All right. I love it. So I think my final decision is I'm staying away from the East because
yes,
we do not trust teams in the East. The Panthers are probably the best team, but if we're going to take the literal comparison that they are the NFC, then we saw how that movie ends. You just don't live up to the talent on the other side. Then looking at the West, I want to get a little bit more value. So I think I'm going to bet 2 futures. I'm going to bet the Knights at 14-1 and the Stars at 10-1. And there's a scenario where that is the Western Conference Finals, and then you're living really good because you're getting one of those two into the Stanley Cup Finals. So I think that's my final decision.
And if you really want to go chaos, there are definitely teams in the East that will make you sweat, but it'd be a fun ride. If you bet the Devils at 25-1 and they get in the playoffs, they can beat anybody if they just get in. That's really the thing. Like you said in the Open, the hockey playoffs are the most wide open because Hockey's so fluky, man. The best team doesn't win a lot of the time in the hockey playoffs. That's the last stat I'll leave you with. The favorite wins in the NHL playoffs the least of any of the four major North American sports. That is the last note I'll leave you with as far as something to think about going into the deadline as we look towards the playoffs.
Yeah, so that would tell you stay away from the Oilers and stay away from the Panthers, the two current betting favorites. And in terms of the Devils, maybe wait for the deadline, see if they make a move for a goalie, and then make a
Yeah.
quick future bet if they do that. That is the plan. But thanks as always for coming on. This is always a fun annual tradition. We'll be doing it again next year. Sure, you'll definitely be on before that as we get into NFL draft, maybe something like that. Get you back in here. So, do you just want to plug some of your stuff before we get out of here?
Sure, thank you. I do Liberty Blue podcast, which is just Rangers hockey. That's every Monday. I do Locked On NHL's National Power Ranking show, which is every Thursday. Do Locked On Flames, which is every day about the Calgary Flames. Yeah, I write a decent amount. You can find it all on my Twitter at Nick Zararis. Other than that, thanks for having me, Blake.
No worries. Thanks to everybody for listening, and we'll catch you next time.